What is going on in the Pac-12 playoff picture? The North is a mess. The South has its own problems. I'm going to discuss it coming up right now. Hey everybody, welcome to Elite Athletes TV. I'm Mike Pulaski, former 11-year pro quarterback and quarterbacks coach here at EliteAthletesTV.com. Today, I want to talk about the Pac-12 playoff picture, and I'm not talking about the college football playoff picture. I'm talking about just the Pac-12 and what's going on. With a season like we've had this year, I don't know how we could expect anything different at the end. Obviously, the late start, or restart, I should say, and then all of the protocols and everything going into the season, lost games, the whole 9 yards. The Pac-12 season has been a shambles from the beginning. But now, they've got a real problem when it comes down to the playoffs. Before I get started, if you haven't done so yet, if you're new to the channel, subscribe, ring that bell. Get notified every time we have new stuff coming out. Give me a thumbs up if you're ready to talk about the Pac-12, and leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear your opinion. I'm going to start in the Pac-12 North because there is a lot going on this week and a lot not going on that would have given us some clarity in the conference. First off, Oregon came in as the favorite to win the Pac-12 North. I did a video that talked about Oregon, new offensive line, new quarterback, and a super young team. 74% of the team are underclassmen. And I said, I thought they were getting more credit than they deserve. I'll put the video right up here. You can check that out. And I got harassed by Oregon fans. Well, it turns out that with a new offensive line and a new quarterback and a really young team, it's hard to win a lot of games. They had a lot of opt-outs. They had a lot of guys that graduated, moved on. Their quarterback last year is going to be playing the Pro Bowl this year. And so it was going to be really tough for them to come back and be as good as they were and to be projected so high. University of Washington has an outbreak on campus. They have, last I heard from an insider, they have in the 40s in terms of eligible players able to play if they were to play Oregon. And so Washington's out, and they're not playing that game this week. It could have been Oregon's redemption, potentially get that playoff shot, go 4-2 on the season, which looks much better. Instead, they're 3-2 right now. They don't get Washington, that rivalry game. And their last two games have been consecutive losses. How can you put them in the Pac-12 playoff picture? If they got a win, maybe that redeems them a little bit, but they don't get to play Washington. Washington, on the other hand, loses their first game against Cal. Not loses, but they get it canceled, so that game's off the schedule. And then they get 4 home games. And they beat Oregon State on a really bad spot by the officials. And so that one comes into question too. But their last game, they play Stanford, who, in my opinion, is a decent football team, but not a great football team. And they lose to Stanford. And so Washington, 3-0 at home, and gets a loss to Stanford for their last game. So that puts the playoff picture in a mess. Stanford, who is now the traveling roadshow because of the Santa Clara County protocols put in place, are on the road. They get the big win at Washington last week, and they get a win versus Cal in the big game 2 weeks ago. So they're on a 2-game winning spree. But they lost versus Oregon, and they lost to Colorado, and they lost pretty handily to Colorado. Oregon State starts off the season by losing to Washington State. They lost to Washington on that bad spot that I was talking about earlier. And then they lose last week to Utah, but Jamar Jefferson was out of that game for protocol issues as well. And so Oregon State, 2-3, they're going to be one of 2 teams, if the game goes off tomorrow, to get the full Pac-12 slate of games in up to this week. And so they can't be the representative. They've got 3 losses coming into that game. Washington State, 1-2 right now. They beat Oregon State to start off the season, and then they lose to Oregon, and then they skip 3 weeks. They haven't played a game since November 14th. Last week, they go into USC, and they run into a buzzsaw. They've been practicing, but they haven't been able to play. A bunch of protocol issues going on up there, a bunch of contact trace issues going on there. And so it's like they restarted their season again to go up against USC. So obviously, they're not going to be the representative. Only 3 games in. They play Cal this weekend. And so that'll be interesting up in the Palouse. I don't know if there's been a game up there this late in the season, but it's going to be cold. So that'll be an interesting game to watch. Then there's Cal. Their first game of the season is canceled due to contact trace and protocol issues. So they don't get that game in. The next week, they're going to play Arizona State, and Arizona State has their own contact trace issues. All the players from the original contact trace at Cal are still in quarantine, but UCLA and Cal reschedule. For that, I applaud both teams being flexible enough to get that done. I've never seen it done in college football up until this season, but this is a weird season. So Cal travels to UCLA. Their entire defensive line was not able to practice with the team for 14 days. No live hitting, no line play, nothing. The game of football is won and lost on the offensive and defensive lines. That's where you win it. That's where you lose it. Inevitably, Cal goes down to UCLA. They lose in the Rose Bowl, and that's one loss. Chalk it off to contact trace, to quarantine, to all of that stuff. The next week, Cal comes back. They've got the D-line intact. They're ready to go. They go to practice. And then, right before the Oregon State game, they pop another contact trace. They lose 5 players. 3 starting offensive linemen, 1 starting outside linebacker, 1 starting tight end. All starters. They lose all these guys going into the game. They lose 2 tackles, and they lose a guard. Then, on the defense, when they lose that outside linebacker, they literally lose 2 personnel groupings that they were going to use in that game. They can't run those personnel groupings because they're thin at that outside linebacker position. They lose to Oregon State. That's a tough loss. I mean, that's a hard one to swallow. Then they come back in the big game, same guys still out, and they lose to Stanford in a heartbreaker on a blocked PAT, which would have tied the game. So they haven't been at full strength for any of their games in the season up to that point against Stanford. They come in, they face University of Oregon, and they're finally at full strength, and they get a win at home versus the team that was projected to be the top team in the conference. So the North is a mess. Teams, players, games, canceled, missing. It's hard to tell what team has strength. It's hard to tell what team is quality because there's been so much inconsistency. Now let's take a look at the South. USC, who was the premier team in the South to start the season, all the projections by the media polls, starts off the season with a win against Arizona State. But to do it, they have to get a tipped ball in the end zone and a last-second touchdown pass by Kedon Slovis. Slovis was awesome to make that pass, and the tip ball, he just threw up for grabs because he knew he had enough sides. Last week, they go up against Washington State, who, again, hadn't played a game since November 14th, and they finally win a quality game. They get a win against the Cougs, but the Cougs have been missing practice. They've been out, contact tracing. And so a 38-13 win in that game looks impressive. I don't know how impressive it really is. Colorado is now 4-0. However, Colorado is the only team to play an out-of-conference game. So they come in 4-0, but only 3-0 in conference. They have looked really good. I picked Colorado as my dark horse to win the Pac-12 South because I thought that Colorado and USC would play. However, Colorado-USC didn't happen, again, because of protocol issues. They've got to play Utah this week. And by the way, USC has to play UCLA. So rivalry games this week. We're going to see what happens if both those teams survive the rivalry games. Once you get below those 2 teams in the South, it gets muddy again. UCLA, as we talked about, they get the win versus Cal. So that goes in, but it's a win with an asterisk because Cal didn't get to practice for 2 weeks with a line in practice. Then they get a win versus ASU, but ASU hasn't played a game in a month. So we'll get to ASU in just a second, but that's kind of a gimme too when a team hasn't played a game in a month to go into that game, and you've been playing week in, week out. UCLA might be the only other team in the conference to get all of their games in on the schedule. So they beat ASU, they beat Cal, and then they beat U of A, which is an entirely different story as well. So those 3 wins are wins. You know, it's hard to win in the Pac-12, but not quality wins by any means. Utah, another team. They lost a ton on offense last year. They graduated a bunch off their defense this year. You always know that a Kyle Whittingham defense is going to be good, and they look good again this year. But they haven't been able to put it all together. Early season, lost a bunch of games. It's been dysfunctional in Utah in terms of protocols, canceled games, the whole 9 yards. And so it's been a difficult season for the Utes. Then we come down to Arizona State. I feel horrible for the Sun Devils this year. Arizona State is 0-2. They've gotten 2 games in this year. It's been contact trace issues. It's been all the protocols around it. They have just had the toughest time in the Pac-12 around everything going on this year in the pandemic. And so I feel bad for them. They got first game versus USC, which they barely lost, again, on that tip ball. And then they went literally a full month before they got their next game in. And so that's like having 2 first games of the season. And of course, that was versus UCLA. You're not going to play well because you play one, you skip a month, you play another one. It's not the way football works. Hopefully they can just finish out the season, get some reps, chalk this off as a scrimmage year. And finally, there's Arizona. I don't think Kevin Sumlin has got it figured out down there. He's got some talent. This year has been weird for everybody, but 0-4, Arizona. They looked decent versus Washington early, but then since then, it hasn't been the same. And so I don't know what's going on in Arizona. So what does that leave us with? You have a Pac-12 North where your best representative, Washington, is 3-1. Games canceled this week. Like I said, there's somewhere in the 40s of players that are actually eligible to play this week. So if you declare Washington the champion of the North as the representative going to the Pac-12 championship game, you don't even know if they're going to be able to play that game. There's a strong possibility that they won't be able to play that game. So if you're the Pac-12 and you take Washington, that's a huge risk. Oregon's lost their last 2 consecutive games. There's no excitement in that anywhere around the country. You want to put your best foot forward, and a 3-2 Oregon on a 2-game losing streak with a game canceled doesn't generate a lot of buzz. In the South, you've got USC, 4-0 if they beat UCLA this week, 5-0 coming into this game. Solid resume. They deserve a shot. Colorado, 3-0 in the Pac-12, 4-0 coming into this week. If they beat Utah, there's an argument there. But because USC has won more games in conference, they would be the representative from the South. Because they didn't play each other, you don't have a clear champion between those two. So the choice the Pac-12 has to make is, A, do you go with tradition, North, and it's not a very long tradition at that, the North playing the South for a Pac-12 champion, or once again, during this year of revised rules, do you revise the rules, and if both teams, Colorado and USC, get wins this weekend, do you let the 2 best winning percentages in the conference play each other for the championship? I think you have to go, if both teams, SC and Colorado, win, they have to play in the championship game. God forbid one of those teams lose a game, then what do you do? Oregon's got a claim to play in that game. Washington clearly has a claim to play in that game, but they're probably not going to have the bodies to play in that game. So what do you do? It's a mess. It started off as a mess. It's still a mess, and it's going to be a mess. There's going to be critics no matter what happens. But if both teams from the South win out this week, I say SC has to play Colorado in the championship game for the Pac-12. 2 ranked teams going into the game. If they want any hope of playing in the college football playoff, which I don't think is a hope at this point, that's the way it has to happen. My opinion, I appreciate you watching. Don't forget, subscribe. Give me a thumbs up. I'll talk to you again soon. A little Pac-12 football breakdown for you. As it is, it's about as clear as milk. Talk to you later.